So, the year is 1258, and the story goes that the Tigris River literally ran black.
Right, black with the ink of a million destroyed books.
Yeah, and then red with the blood of the scholars who wrote them, which is just, it's a terrifying image. The Mongol siege of Baghdad.
It really is. It wasn't just the end of a political dynasty. It was the absolute apocalyptic termination of this massive 500-year civilizational engine.
But today, we're not just looking at the destruction, we're looking at how that medieval empire was built in the first place, how it survived in a world that was just profoundly fractured.
Exactly. And more importantly, why the psychological blueprint of the Abbasid Caliphate is actually the exact structural blueprint of your mind.
Yes. And we are talking directly to you, Tommy. This deep dive is built entirely around a really specific set of notes we received titled Tommy Abbasid Caliphate.
It's a pretty radical way to look at a psychological profile, I have to say.
It is, but it makes so much sense when you dig into it. The notes basically argue that human consciousness, especially a really creative, constantly churning consciousness that's under pressure, it doesn't work like a neat, perfect architectural grid.
Right. It's not a spreadsheet.
No, it operates like a sprawling, chaotic, multi-generational empire that is constantly just trying to stave off entropy.
Which brings us right to you, Tommy, because the notes define your specific subpersonality profile as an imaginative architect.
And an agent of controlled chaos, which is a great title, by the way.
Yeah, and a meaning seeker and a connector of the fragmented.
So your whole operating philosophy, Tommy, is to take the mess-like, the scattered ideas, the conflicting interests you have, and synthesize all of it into blueprints or systems or art.
And under pressure, the notes say your mind looks exactly like a base at Baghdad.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I love this image.
Yeah, it's like a lamplit workshop in the middle of a global storm. You're pulling in 100 different influences and just desperately trying to turn them into something structurally sound.
Because history is never just about, memorizing dates and maps. It's about systems. It's how huge networks of human beings process information, how they survive trauma.
And how they adapt to impossible pressures, which the Abbasid Caliphate, ruling from roughly 750 to 1258 CE, did incredibly well. They thrived in a world that was incredibly messy and violently unstable.
And what's fascinating here is that they didn't survive by just building a giant wall and hiding.
No, not at all. Or through, pure iron-fisted military dominance. They survived through this unrivaled, almost obsessive ability to integrate complexity.
So let's look at the literal ground they chose to build this empire on, because you don't build a massive engine of cultural synthesis in a vacuum. You build it in the mud.
You really do.
So it's 750 CE. The Abbasids launched this massive revolution, and they completely overthrow the existing Umayyad Caliphate.
Right, it's a violent, massive rupture.
Huge. And the Umayyads, up until then, had been centered in Damascus, over in Syria. They were looking westward toward the Mediterranean world.
But the Abbasids pivot entirely. They shift the whole geopolitical center of gravity to the east.
Right into Mesopotamia.
Exactly. And eventually, in 762 CE, they build a brand new imperial center, Baghdad.
And that geographic shift is like the foundational algorithmic change of their whole system. By moving to the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, they were making a very deliberate calculation.
A calculation about energy and information.
Yes. Let's talk about the energy first, caloric energy.
Right, because Mesopotamia offered this incredible riverine agriculture. It was capable of feeding massive, hyper-dense urban populations.
Which you need. You can't sustain a cultural explosion if everyone is just struggling to find food.
Exactly. You need a massive agricultural surplus to feed all the people who are sitting around doing the thinking.
Caloric energy is the battery of a civilization. But moving to Mesopotamia also changed all their data inputs.
How so?
Well, Damascus was a Mediterranean city. It was deeply tied to the old Roman and Byzantine worlds. But when they moved to Baghdad, they basically dropped themselves onto the ultimate global crossroads.
Oh, right. The trade routes.
Yeah, they had direct links stretching east into the Persian Plateau and Central Asia, down south toward the Indian Ocean, and west back toward the Mediterranean.
They hardwired themselves into the exact center of the Afro-Eurasian landmass.
Exactly. It became the premier hub for absorbing foreign systems.
Because the physical trade routes carrying Persian bureaucracy and Indian mathematics and Greek philosophy, they literally ran right through their front door.
And this is a glaring issue when you look at a map. Mesopotamia has a massive liability.
The vulnerability.
Yes, there are absolutely no natural defenses. There's no impassable mountain range perfectly boxing in Baghdad. It's historically one of the most easily invaded corridors on Earth.
It really is.
So setting up your capital there, it's kind of like setting up your creative studio in the middle of a bustling, noisy train station.
That's a great analogy.
Right. You can't control who walks through. You don't have a door to lock. You are just subjected to this constant barrage of noise and potential threats.
But you're sacrificing impenetrable security for maximum exposure.
And the strategic calculation they made to solve that is brilliant. Because if you can't defend the train station with wall...
You defend it with utility.
Yes. You make everyone need the train station.
Precisely. You weave your capital so deeply into the economic and intellectual fabric of the world that destroying it actually hurts your enemies.
They became an indispensable node.
Right. The merchants in India, the scholars in Persia, the governors in North Africa, they all started to rely on the Abbasid network.
For trade velocity, intellectual exchange, all of it.
They built a system where their own survival was basically subsidized by the broader global ecosystem.
And Tommy, this maps exactly to your internal architecture. Your specific creative energy as an imaginative architect, it thrives in dynamic, highly stimulated environments.
You don't do well retreating into some isolated, perfectly quiet mental bunker.
No. If you try to wall yourself off from distraction, you actually starve the engine. You need the collision of ideas. You need the chaos of the train station.
The vulnerability to distraction is the feature, not the bug.
Right. But to manage that kind of influx, to run a studio in a train station without completely losing your mind, you need a very specific kind of management.
Often a very ruthless kind.
Which brings us to the actual architects of the Abbasid state. And honestly, reading through the psychological breakdown of these caliphs in the notes, it reads like a diagnostic manual for a profoundly conflicted mind.
It really does. You have a lineage of rulers who were simultaneously brilliant builders and just absolute destroyers.
You can't build a multi-century civilization without getting your hands dirty. Let's trace this lineage because it mirrors the phases of a complex creative project perfectly.
Let's start with the founder, Abu al-Abbas al-Safa,
who ruled from 750 to 754, and his historical nickname is literally the Bloodshedder.
Right, so al-Safa represents the revolutionary rupture. His role was almost entirely destructive.
He didn't build institutions, did he?
No, he dismantled the Umayyad power structure with extreme prejudice. He forged his legitimacy through sheer force.
He's the violent transition. When a system is so stagnant it can't be reformed, it just has to be eradicated.
Exactly.
So Tommy, he is the phase of your creative process where you violently tear down the old draft.
You realize the current framework just isn't working.
Right, you highlight the entire document, hit delete, and scorch the earth. You can't build the new thing until the old thing is gone.
But pure destruction isn't sustainable. Eventually, you need a blueprint.
Which requires the second caliph, Al-Mansur,
who ruled from 754 to 775. And he is the true structural architect of the Abbasid state.
If al-Safa was the fire, Al-Mansur is the engine that actually harnesses that heat.
He's the one who literally laid out the circular city of Baghdad. He was incredibly cold, calculating, and ruthlessly pragmatic.
He centralized the administration and stabilized the finances, right?
Yes, and he heavily entrenched a Persian-influenced bureaucracy to actually run the day-to-day operations of the empire.
Wait, let me pause there. A Persian-influenced bureaucracy. The Abbasids are an Arab dynasty. Why are they importing a Persian operating system to run their state?
Well, because the Persian Sassanid Empire, which predated the Islamic conquests, they had centuries of experience managing vast, multi-ethnic, agrarian empires.
Okay.
The early Arab conquerors were highly effective militarily, but administering a sprawling tax base across thousands of miles, that requires a massive administrative machine.
And the Persians already had that technology.
Exactly. Al-Mansur recognized that the Persian tradition had the exact administrative code the Abbasids needed. He wasn't constrained by cultural purity. He was driven by systemic efficiency.
So he just copy-pasted the Persian system.
Basically, yes. He executed rivals without hesitation, but he built the durable political structure that allowed the whole civilization to function.
So Al-Mansur is the outlining phase for Tommy. It's not glamorous at all. It's the grueling, structural, how are we actually going to execute this phase?
But once that machine is humming, you reach the era everyone romanticizes.
Harun al-Rashid.
Yes, ruling from 786 to 809. the absolute zenith of the empire.
This is the era mythologized in the Thousand and One Nights. Immense wealth, cultural flourishing.
Global diplomacy, too. I mean, he famously exchanged gifts with Charlemagne in Europe. The court life was incredibly sophisticated.
So Harun is the flow state writing phase. Everything is clicking, the aesthetic is gorgeous, the ideas are brilliant.
But if you look closely at the mechanics of his reign, he's also the one who planted the dynamite that would eventually fracture the empire.
Oh, right, the succession crisis.
He makes the decision to divide the empire's succession between his two sons, El-Amin and Al-Mamun.
And that division triggers a catastrophic civil war the absolute second he dies. But why would he do that? Was it just pure arrogance?
It was an attempt to solve a massive structural problem, actually. Network latency.
Network latency in the 8th century.
Think about it. At its peak, the caliphate stretched from modern-day Tunisia all the way to the borders of India.
Okay, that's huge.
And in a pre-industrial world, information moves at the speed of a horse or a sailing ship.
Right.
So if a rebellion breaks out in the eastern province of Khorasan, it could take months for Baghdad to even hear about it, let alone deploy an army.
So the geographic bandwidth was just exceeded.
Exactly. Harun al-Rashid divided the administration between his sons to create localized nodes of authority. He hoped it would make the empire more responsive.
He was trying to decentralize the server load.
That's a perfect way to put it. But he miscalculated the human element. Absolute power has gravity.
And instead of cooperating, his sons just turned their halves of the empire against each other.
The resulting civil war from 809 to 813 physically devastated Baghdad. It introduced deep factionalism into the military, too.
It was the beginning of the permanent internal fracture. The guy who gives you the golden age is also the guy who hands you the sledgehammer.
And the victor of that civil war is his son, Al-Mamun.
Who takes over. And Al-Mamun is just this fascinating paradox, because on one hand, he champions the House of Wisdom.
Yes, he makes the pursuit of science and philosophy and massive translation movements official state policy.
He aggressively seeks out Greek, Persian, and Indian texts. He elevates scholars to the absolute top of society.
He's heralded as a massive hero of intellectual history.
Right, but hold on. Because I have to challenge this hero of intellect narrative. The notes emphasize that he also enforced the mina.
The Inquisition.
Literally an inquisition. He subjected religious scholars to brutal interrogations, imprisonment, torture, if they didn't publicly agree with his highly specific, state-sanctioned theology.
About the created nature of the Quran.
Yeah, how do we square that? A scientific renaissance on one hand and a violent theological dictatorship on the other. It sounds like massive cognitive dissonance.
It's only cognitive dissonance if we assume intellectual curiosity and the desire for absolute control are mutually exclusive.
Which they aren't.
Not for Al-Mamun. For him, there were two sides of the exact same coin. The pursuit of ultimate systemic coherence.
Oh, wow.
He wanted a perfectly rational, unified intellectual framework for his empire. Greek philosophy gave him the rational tools, and his specific flavor of theology offered the moral framework.
So the mina wasn't anti-intellectual at all.
No, it was the ruthless enforcement of what he believed was the ultimate intellectual synthesis. He demanded perfection, and he used state violence to get it.
So for Tommy, Al-Mamun is the brutal inner critic phase.
Exactly. The editor who demands absolute brilliance, who insists on the highest possible rigor, but totally tortures the author in the process.
And the notes map this chaotic cast of caliphs directly to your shadow self, Tommy. When you feel overwhelmed by your own internal empire, when you have scattered interests and crippling perfectionism.
It's because you have all these different caliphs fighting for the throne in your head.
You've got the revolutionary urge to tear down your work like Al-Safa, the cold desire to build strict systems like Al-Mansur,
The indulgent flow state that loses track of structural limits like Harun.
and the brutal inquisitorial perfectionism of Al-Mamun. And the crucial realization here is that the Abbasid greatness didn't exist in spite of this messy leadership. It existed because of it.
A perfectly peaceful, uniform mind rarely produces revolutionary output.
The friction between the builder and the destroyer, that's the energy source.
But the politicians were really only the scaffolding. While the caliphs were fighting these civil wars, a totally different group of people were operating within that structure.
The synthesizers, the scholars who provided the eternal cultural heartbeat.
Because the Abbasid era was defined by this massive cultural flowering, they emphasized this concept of cultivated manners, literary intelligence.
Aesthetic refinement, but their true superpower, the engine of their historical weight, was their translation and synthesis movement.
We really need to reframe how we view innovation today. We romanticize the lone genius, the isolated inventor having a spontaneous eureka moment.
Right, like an apple falling on their head.
Exactly. But the Abbasid genius wasn't spontaneous invention, it was civilization-level engineering. They excelled at collecting, translating, systematizing, and refining inherited knowledge,
They took the fragmented intellectual debris of fallen empires and just fused it all together.
turning Arabic into the universal semantic code for science.
Let's trace how this actually worked, because the notes highlight a few of these world builders of knowledge. You start with someone like Hunayn ibn Ishaq in the 9th century.
The foundational translator.
But he isn't just like copying words from a Greek manuscript into Arabic, right?
Not at all. Translation at that level is an act of profound creation. When he was translating Aristotle or Galen, he was encountering highly complex, abstract Greek concepts.
For which no Arabic words existed.
Right. He couldn't just open a dictionary. He had to invent the semantic architecture. He created new Arabic terminology that accurately captured the nuance of Greek thought.
He was literally building the conceptual roads that later thinkers would travel on.
And then a few decades later, you get a figure like Al-Razi in the medical field.
Who takes those translated concepts but doesn't just treat them as holy writ.
Exactly. Al-Razi applies empirical rigor. The Greeks relied heavily on theoretical frameworks like the four humors, which were often totally disconnected from actual clinical outcomes.
Well, what does Al-Razi do?
He takes the theory and tests it against intense clinical observation. He ran early forms of control groups in hospitals.
Wait, really? Control groups in the 9th century?
Yes, he wrote medical texts based on empirical reality. He was effectively debugging the ancient Greek code.
I love that, debugging the code. And while medicine is being debugged, you have Al-Khwarizmi dealing with the underlying mathematics of the universe.
Right, taking Indian numeral systems and ancient arithmetic and totally transforming them.
Because arithmetic is practical. It's how a merchant calculates a transaction, but Al-Khwarizmi transformed it into an abstract structural discipline.
He created algebra,
And the concept of the algorithm.
a systemic, repeatable set of rules for solving a specific problem. He gave the world the mathematical language required to handle immense complexity at scale.
And finally, you have Al-Farabi, who the notes specifically flag as peak Tommy energy.
He really is. Al-Farabi looks at this massive influx of rationalist Greek philosophy, and he looks at the revelatory theological framework of Islam. Two massive, seemingly incompatible operating systems.
And rather than choosing one and discarding the other, he builds a philosophical bridge.
He synthesizes them. He creates a framework where rational inquiry and divine revelation are just two different dialects speaking the same ultimate truth.
He is the ultimate connector of fragmented systems, and this is a huge, but none of this synthesis scales without a medium.
No, it doesn't.
You can have the greatest minds in the world, but if they are writing on clay tablets or animal skins, the ideas just don't travel.
Which brings us to the Battle of Talis in 751 CE. One of the most fascinating geopolitical domino effects ever.
Yes, the expanding Abbasid military crashes into the Tang dynasty of China and Central Asia. The Abbasids win, but the greatest spoil of war wasn't gold.
It was a technology captured from Chinese prisoners. Paper.
To understand the magnitude of this, you have to look at the immense friction of the existing information economy. Before paper, the Middle East relied on the papyrus,
Which is incredibly fragile and pretty much limited geographically to Egypt.
where they used parchment, which is specially treated animal skin.
It's luxury leather. You need an entire flock of sheep just to produce one substantial book. The economic barrier to entry for knowledge was astronomically high.
Right, information moved so slowly and was restricted to the absolute elite. But paper.
Paper can be produced from hemp, rags, plant fibers. It's cheap, it's durable, and it's highly scalable.
So when the Abbasids extracted this technology, they systematically built paper mills all across the empire.
It was a massive accelerant. It dropped the cost of knowledge production to near zero compared to parchment.
Moving to a paper economy altered the entire velocity of human thought. A scholar in Baghdad could write a treatise on algebra, it could be copied cheaply, and within months, a student in Cairo and a physician in Spain are reading it.
And debating it and sending their critiques back. It created a continent-spanning peer review network.
The network density just exploded. Books moved out of locked palace vaults and into the souks, the markets, the mosques.
The civilization transitioned from a hardware-heavy model of isolated thinkers to a cloud computing model of interconnected minds.
And Tommy, this is where your psychological profile locks in completely. As an imaginative architect, you pull from disparate genres, metaphors from sci-fi, emotional beats from music, structural logic from coding.
But your superpower is your internal paper, your note-taking systems, your externalized memory, your whiteboards.
You reduce the friction of your own ideas. You don't invent in a vacuum. You absorb, translate, and remix across a dense internal network.
But here is the inherent danger of a golden age. When you build a sprawling machine that absorbs everything, it reaches a critical mass.
The sheer volume of the network outgrows the capacity of the central processor.
And it begins to absorb its own toxic byproducts.
Right, because the immense wealth and intellectual leisure of Baghdad wasn't generated by magic. It required an economic engine.
And by the mid-9th century, that engine begins to overheat, leading to massive internal fractures.
Which brings us to the dark underbelly of this synthesis, the Zanj Rebellion.
Lasting from 869 to 883. It is a crucial diagnostic marker. The Abbasid elite needed massive agricultural yields to fund their armies and translation movements.
So what do? They import tens of thousands of enslaved people, primarily from East Africa, the Zanj,
To clear the toxic malarial salt marshes of southern Iraq and turn them into arable plantation land.
It's the ultimate hypocrisy. In Baghdad, scholars are translating Aristotle's ethics and debating the theological nature of justice.
Meanwhile, a few hundred miles south, a brutalized underclass is being worked to death in literal toxic swamps to subsidize that philosophical debate.
And when that underclass inevitably revolted, it wasn't just a minor skirmish.
No, it was a 14-year existential crisis. It exposed the deep systemic rot in the economic base of the caliphate.
The central Abbasid military, which had grown reliant on foreign mercenary forces by this point, struggled massively to contain it.
The rebellion devastated the agricultural heartland, completely starving the capital of its revenue.
The structural foundation cracks, and this economic crisis accelerates a massive political shift. The glorious, centralized control of al-Mansur and Harun al-Rashid totally disintegrates.
Real political and military power seeps right out of Baghdad, into the hands of provincial dynasties and military strongmen.
By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Abbasid Caliph is effectively a hostage in his own palace.
Turkic military factions like the Seljuks take control of the actual state machinery.
The empire basically pivots to a franchise model.
Yes.
It's trying to map this onto a modern concept, and a corporate franchise is exactly how it functions. The Abbasids used to own and operate the entire corporation. They cooked the food, hired the guards, collected the revenue.
But the geography was too vast, and rebellions like the Zanj were too costly.
So they stopped running the daily operations. They let the Seljuk warlords and regional emirs run the military and tax collection.
But those warlords still desperately need legitimacy. They have the swords, but they don't have the moral authority to rule an Islamic populace.
So they essentially lease the Abbasid logo.
That's a brilliant operational definition. The regional strongmen stamp the caliph's face on their coins. They raid his name in the Friday prayers.
The Abbasids surrendered direct military control in exchange for absolute, untouchable, symbolic legitimacy.
They transitioned from being the CEO of the company to being the brand mascot.
But here's the operational question. If the central government is utterly powerless, if warlords are running the provinces and rival caliphates are popping up in Egypt and Spain, how does the civilization not just instantly evaporate into a dark age?
How did the society hold together? Because of the network density we discussed earlier. The civilization had woven a web so intricate and highly trafficked that the politicians couldn't tear it apart even if they wanted to.
The structural integrity bypassed the political failure.
Exactly.
So explain the mechanics of that. How does a merchant in the market compensate for a failed state?
By relying on shared, decentralized protocols. Even if the caliph in Baghdad has no army, the merchant traveling from Damascus to Bukhara still uses the same Arabic language to negotiate his contracts.
Right.
He relies on the same framework of Islamic law, the Sharia, to resolve contract disputes. And that's enforced by local judges, not the central state.
The scholars are still using the same Arabic numerals to calculate astronomical charts.
The millions of citizens are still unified by the synchronized rhythms of daily prayer, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. The cultural, religious, and economic operating system was so deeply embedded that the failure of the political hardware in Baghdad barely disrupted the software.
The habits outlive the discipline.
Beautifully said, yes.
Tommy, this is an incredibly powerful operational insight for your own psychology. When your internal state fails, when your executive function collapses, or your focus is entirely fractured,
When the central processor of your motivation goes completely offline.
you don't have to collapse into a dark age because you've built a franchise model. You rely on the density of your own internal network.
Your daily routines, your automated systems, your accumulated muscle memory in your creative pursuits, those are the merchants and the local judges.
When the caliph in your brain is powerless, you let the network run the empire on autopilot. You survive the fracture by trusting the systems you built during your golden age.
But we must acknowledge the final, brutal reality of this model.
Right.
A decentralized network is incredibly resilient against internal decay and localized trauma. It can absorb a massive amount of damage.
But it possesses a fatal flaw.
Yes. When confronted by a unified, highly centralized, overwhelmingly powerful external force, a decentralized network cannot coalesce quickly enough to form a defensive shield.
The network meets the buzzsaw, which brings us to the apocalyptic conclusion of our timeline, the fall and the echo.
The year is 1258 CE.
The Abbasids have been playing this delicate franchise game of symbolic legitimacy for centuries, but the Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, do not care about symbolic legitimacy.
No, they don't want to lease the brand. They want to liquidate the assets.
The Mongol arrival is a civilizational extinction event for the political state. They encircle Baghdad.
And the Caliph, perhaps believing his own myth of untouchable legitimacy, fails to mount an adequate defense.
The Mongols breach the walls and unleash systematic, absolute devastation. The physical infrastructure that took 500 years to build the Grand Canals, the libraries, the translation centers, is dismantled.
The population is massacred.
Yeah.
And the Caliph himself is executed.
And the way he died is so brutal. Because the Mongols had a superstition against spilling royal blood on the earth, they allegedly rolled the Caliph up in a carpet and trampled him to death with their horses.
It is the definitive, brutal termination of the Abbasid Empire in Mesopotamia. The system simply could not process a threat of that magnitude.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale of over-decentralization. But here is where I have to pause and look at this objectively.
Yeah.
Because if I'm analyzing the lifespan of this empire, they lose their military power, they fracture internally, their economy relies on brutal exploitation, and ultimately, an external enemy slaughters their leadership and burns their capital to the ground. From a strictly operational standpoint, doesn't that mean the Abbasid experiment was an objective failure? The system collapsed.
If you measure success purely by the preservation of a specific political border, or a specific royal bloodline, then yes, it failed.
But
the notes argue vehemently against that metric, because history doesn't care about borders, it cares about impact.
okay, unpack that.
The physical structure of Baghdad collapsed in 1258, but the legacy of the Abbasids had already escaped the city centuries before the Mongols arrived.
The algorithm survives the sword.
Precisely. The libraries in Baghdad burned, but the medical textbooks of al-Razi had already been copied and carried across North Africa to Islamic Spain.
The mathematical frameworks of al-Khwarizmi had already seeped into the broader Mediterranean.
When the Ottoman Empire eventually rises, it builds its bureaucratic and cultural foundation directly on the surviving Abbasid blueprint.
And when Europe begins to claw its way out of its own intellectual stagnation, it is fueled directly by the Latin translations of the Arabic texts, preserved, refined, and synthesized by the Abbasid network.
They fundamentally rewired the intellectual trajectory of the human species. The corporate headquarters was destroyed, but the intellectual property conquered the world.
That distinction between the fragility of the structure and the immortality of the impact is the ultimate takeaway for you, Tommy.
As an imaginative architect, you are constantly battling the antagonist of entropy. You build projects, you design elaborate systems, you outline massive creative endeavors.
And sometimes those specific structures collapse. A project fails. A business venture dissolves. The specific empire you were trying to build gets overrun by external pressures or internal burnout.
And the natural psychological response to that collapse is despair. You view the destruction of the project as a total failure of your identity.
Right. But the Abbasid blueprint preaches that the project is not the legacy. The skills you forge while building that doomed project, the massive intellectual connections you make, the fragments of synthesis you write down on your own internal paper, those survive the collapse.
The tools you invent to manage your own controlled chaos remain yours, even when the specific goal they were built for is abandoned.
And that leads us to a profound final reflection, building directly on the core insight of your source notes.
We've established that the Abbasid political structure was annihilated, Yet its cultural network effectively shaped the modern world. This demands a massive reframing of how you evaluate your own creative output.
How so?
Are you judging your success solely by how perfectly you can maintain the strict structure of your projects? Are you constantly measuring your self-worth against the finished, polished, easily consumable end product?
Because if your entire identity is tied to defending the walls of a specific project, you are setting yourself up for the exact same devastation the final caliphs felt when their city fell.
What if your true value as an imaginative architect isn't the finished building at all?
What if your legacy is the debris?
Exactly. What if your true success lies in the scattered blueprints, the raw, brilliant fragments of synthesis, and the highly pressurized, controlled chaos you leave in your wake?
Wow.
What if your ultimate purpose is to create a dense enough network of ideas that others, or simply future versions of yourself 10 years down the line, can pick up those surviving fragments from the ruins and translate them into something entirely new?
That changes everything. It means the diagnostic muddy waters of your mind aren't a sign that the machine is broken. The muddy waters are where the clay is. It's where the raw material of synthesis lives. You don't need impenetrable walls and perfectly clean architectural lines to build something eternal. You just need to be willing to sit in that lamplit workshop in the dead center of the noise and relentlessly keep connecting the fragments.